Hello, and welcome to the Watcher's review of Revelation of the Daleks, story of Grave Robbing and ending famine in quite possibly the most unique Dalek story in the show's history, at a time when the show's future itself was in doubt. Please be aware there are potential spoilers ahead. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted for more content. The Doctor and Peri arrive on the planet Necros, where the Doctor wishes to pay his respects to his old friend Arthur Stengos, little knowing he has been played into a ruse by Davros, who has found a new way to create a new army of Daleks. The development of the Sixth Doctor post-regeneration had been a slower development than previous incarnations, with the Doctor having a thunderous, stubborn, aloof persona, with Peri often finding herself on the receiving end of his temper. However, by Revelation of the Daleks, the Doctor is settled by showing more compassion and empathy, while still maintaining his original traits, although reserved more for his adversaries than Peri. Having said that, the Doctor and Peri still spar in exchanging insults, in this case about each other's weight, but when required, the Doctor still shows concern in ensuring Peri is safe from the Dalek attacks. However, the harsher side of his persona is shown with his interactions with Chief Embalmer Jobil, who he is repulsed by, and he mocks Colin Baker, and is understandably hostile to Davros' scheme. The Doctor by and large isn't at the centre of events in this story, with himself and Peri being separate from the rest of the characters in the first half. Although this is uncommonplace for the Doctor not to be as directly involved in the story, Colin Baker probably gives his most balanced and strongest performance as the Doctor. It is well documented of the troubles the show endured during his era as the Doctor, but I feel it is unfair to direct them at Colin Baker. His approach to the Doctor wasn't to everyone's satisfaction, but it was a bold new approach to the character and a reminder that he isn't human, and doesn't necessarily mean he has to be empathetic as a human while still being the hero. As I have just mentioned, the relationship between Peri and the Doctor has mellowed by the time of Revelation of the Daleks. Unfortunately, she isn't given much to do in this story. In the first episode, she helps the Doctor out when he is attacked by a mutant, and takes an interest in a flower that is natural to Necros, which she wants to take home to Earth. In the second episode, she has yet another character obsessing over her in the form of Jobil, which adds to his unpleasantness. However, her best part probably comes when she meets the DJ, played by Alexei Sale. The DJ is tasked with playing music to those bodies lying in stasis and keeping them up to date with events so that when they are released, they aren't out of touch, but more of that later. Peri becomes interested due to him playing 20th century music and his American accent. She goes to meet the DJ, who it turns out hasn't even been to Earth, and that the American accent was fake based on tapes of DJs. Nevertheless, Peri still strikes a bond with him, and for once we have a character who isn't sexually obsessed with Peri. The bond between Peri and the DJ, as well as wanting to add a flower to her collection for her botany studies, shows that Peri is maybe missing home and thinking of her returning, not necessarily due to the Doctor, but naturally feeling homesick. Peri would only feature in 2 more stories in the following season before leaving the show in one of the oddest ways seen in the series, but that story can wait for another review. This was Davros' 4th appearance in the show since his debut in 1975, and the second with Terry Malloy in the part, making him the first actor to reprise the role. It is implied that the events in Revelation of the Daleks take place after Resurrection of the Daleks, with the Doctor mentioning how he assumed Davros was blown up. However, from Davros' perspective, he must have already had an interaction with the Sixth Doctor, having been fully aware of his appearance to the point of him erecting a memorial of him. This story develops the character of Davros beyond the realms of being in a Dalek-orientated environment, as was the case in his previous 3 stories. In Revelation of the Daleks, he goes by the alias of the Great Healer, naturally to hide his true identity, given that by now humans and other species were more than aware of who he is and his affiliation to the Daleks. Here, he is supposedly ending a galaxy-spread famine with a cheaply manufactured protein he distributes in return for funding for his operations at Tranquil Repose, the sort of funeral parlour become human storage facility. In truth, this is all a cover for his true scheme, in which the protein he is distributing is actually the recycled remains of dead bodies at tranquil repose, and with the bodies in stasis actually being genetically altered to become a new race of Daleks loyal to Davros only, and then focus on converting the survivors of the famine who have been living off the protein he has been distributing. This is Davros arguably his most scheming and inventing. He has built a false identity of the great healer, giving this hero-like identity across the galaxy, all the while plotting in the most gruesome of ways. Due to this persona he created, his character is also given more dimension, with him showing humour towards Kara, his business partner, in the manufacture of the protein. He even portrays dark humour when putting to the Doctor that informing the famine sufferers that they are eating their own deceased relatives would create what he calls consumer resistance. Out of all of the stories to feature Davros in the classic Doctor Who series, this is the one which allows him to somewhat break free from the environment of the Daleks, with his scheme initially taking him away from the whole plan of making Daleks the supreme being. Naturally, that is his ultimate goal, but by merely focusing on that would have brought further repetition to his stories and kept him as one-dimensional. You could argue that this is a story where Davros fully becomes a villain of his own, rather than just being an add-on to the Dalek culture. The downside to a story featuring Davros is that the Daleks are usually downgraded. Given that the title features the word Daleks and is about Davros building a new Dalek army, the Daleks are actually very limited in appearance and threat. In Revelation of the Daleks, they are more or less reduced to Davros's personal guards, escorts, messengers, and eventually execution squad when someone becomes a liability. However, their dialogue is limited, and they actually don't kill anyone until the second episode. Given their reduced effectiveness, there are some new takes on the now 22-year-old antagonists of the Doctor. Firstly, there is a whole new concept of Daleks hovering. When the show returned in 2005, and the Daleks made their return in the episode Dalek, it was heavily publicised how they can now hover upstairs. But Daleks hovering upstairs was shown as the iconic climax to episode 1 of 1988's Remembrance of the Daleks, and even further back here in Revelation of the Daleks, you see a Dalek and Davros hovering off the floor. The concept had actually been implied as far back as 1965's The Chase, but Revelation of the Daleks is the first story to actually show a Dalek hovering without assistance. Secondly, you have the debut of the white and gold Daleks, which had been genetically designed to be loyal to Davros, who would later be addressed as Imperial Daleks. Compared to the traditional renegade Daleks, the Imperials also have slightly higher pitched voices. You also have the brief appearance of the glass Dalek, which was the remains of Arthur Stengos, a concept thought of Doctor Who's very first script editor, David Whittaker, was included in the novelisation of the Daleks in 1964. The renegade Daleks show up later on in the story, having been tipped off to Davros's whereabouts by Tarkis and Lilt, and embark on a mini-battle with the Imperials before capturing Davros at the climax of the story. There are a host of one-off characters I could focus on in this review, and it could have easily been Jobel, Tazenbeaker, Tarkis, Lilt or Kara, but I've decided to go for Orcini. Orcini was a knight of the Grand Order of Oberon, who had found himself excommunicated and forced to make a living as an assassin. He is hired by Kara to assassinate Davros, which Orcini sees as a great honour. Complete with his squire Bostock, they travel to Tranquil Repose to carry out the mission, only to find he was double-crossed by Kara when a transmitter she gave him turned out to be a bomb. In an act of sacrifice, he uses the bomb to destroy the storage units of Tranquil Repose. Orcini and Bostock were based on Don Quixote and his squire Sancho Panza, and the character is full of charm, chivalry, modesty, and passion towards his job. He is charming towards Kara when she hires him, but vows to kill her should he be double-crossed, a promise he later fulfills. He likes to be alert with his faulty weaponry and technology. His faithful gun, which he uses to destroy a Dalek, has a tendency to jam and was responsible once for him losing part of his leg. He has a faulty prosthetic leg, which jams when he tries to sit down, but refuses to have it repaired, so he always remains standing and alert. As assassins go, Orcini is a likeable character, and upon recognising his title, the Doctor gives his full respect, and the two collaborate in ending Davros' scheme. Orcini was played by William Gaunt, making his only screen appearance in Doctor Who. However, he did feature in some of the audio dramas. Overall, the cast is very strong, with a lot of the actors featuring having previously been in Doctor Who or would go on to appear in more stories. Firstly, you have Terry Malloy, who is playing Davros for a second time and playing again in Remembrance of the Daleks, but also played the undercover policeman Russell earlier in season 22 story Attack of the Cybermen. Eleanor Bron, who played Kara, had previously appeared in the 1979 story City of Death. Hugh Walters, who played Vogel, previously appeared in 1965's The Chase as William Shakespeare, and in 1976's The Deadly Assassin. Clive Swift, who plays Jobel, will be recognisable to British viewers as Richard Bucket from the sitcom Keeping Up Appearances, but also went on to play Mr. Copper in the 2007 story Voyage of the Damned. Trevor Cooper, who plays Tarkis, also played Friar Tuck in the 2014 story Robot of Sherwood, and Colin Spall, who played Lilt, would also go on to play Mr. Crane in the 2006 stories Rise of the Cybermen and The Age of Steel. Also, you have William Gaunt playing Orcini, who appeared in the 1960s British TV series The Champions, and Jenny Thomason, who played Tazenbeaker, having previously appeared in the 1970s costume drama Upstairs Downstairs. Not forgetting, of course, alternative comedian Alexei Sale, who made his name in the 80s, in particular the sitcom The Young Ones. Although it isn't uncommon for Doctor Who to reuse actors, it is rare for the actors overall in a singular story to be so strong in terms of acting ability, and they certainly add to the richness of the script. Revelation of the Daleks was written by script editor Eric Saywood, who took inspiration from Evelyn Waugh's novel The Loved One, which is based around a funeral home, and the 1973 film Soylent Green, regarding using dead humans as food to solve famine. Saywood has also seemingly taken influence from fellow Doctor Who writer and friend Robert Holmes, with the use of dark humour, mercenaries, in-depth characterisation, and double acts. The story is rich in characters throughout, and they all have an involvement in the ongoings at Tranquil Repose. These characters are then paired together to bounce off with dialogue to be polar opposites. Aside from the Doctor with Peri and Davros with the Daleks, you have Orcini and Bostock on their assassination mission. You then have Lilt and Tarkis, who run the security in preventing grave robbers, who secretly conspire to contact the renegade Daleks to capture Davros. Then you have Jobel and Tazenbeaker, who are the embalmers. Jobel is a repulsive, vain individual with an inflated opinion of himself, whilst Tazenbeaker, who is his understudy, is in love with Jobel, even though he treats her horribly, something which Davros exploits to convince Tazenbeaker to murder Jobel. You then have Natasha Stengos and her alcoholic medic Grigory on a mission to rescue her father Arthur before finding out he's been converted into a Dalek, as well as Kara and her accountant assistant Vogel, who conspire to kill Davros and double-cross Orcini and Bostock. The 45-minute episode format featured for this season benefits the characters in this story, with the first episode used to establish the depth of the guest characters and having the already established Doctor and Peri separate. The Doctor and Peri being isolated for the first episode also allows their own development that has been in progress since the Sixth Doctor's debut story, The Twin Dilemma. The second episode then pushes with the narrative, with all these key characters playing their moves in the ending of Davros' operations, as well as some meeting their demise. During this period of Doctor Who, the show was being criticised, not for the first time, of its use of violence, given its classification as a kids' TV show and it being broadcast in the early evening, and Revelation of the Daleks is no exception. 2 characters are stabbed, including one with a syringe. Grigory and Natasha are beaten up and tortured by Lilt and Tarkis, with Grigory having alcohol forced down him, and Davros has his hand blown off. For me, I feel sometimes the violence adds to the bleak nature of a story, if the story demands it, and I actually feel Revelation of the Daleks does. Violence can look out of place in the wrong context in any medium, not just in Doctor Who. But the deaths are over the top. In particular, Joe Bill's death by syringe is purposely overdramatic, with his wig falling off in the process. I can understand violence though, whether being over the top or not being suitable for younger children, so bear that in mind if younger ones want to watch this story. Eric Saywood considered this his best story, and while I think he has written better, this is definitely one of his strongest, and one of Doctor Who's best examples of having deep detail into guest characters. This was Graham Harper's second and final story he directed in the classic era, having directed the previous season's story, The Caves of Androzani. Both stories, despite coming across as very different, convey similar themes in regard to the bleak and dark nature, and focus on characters in part to Harper's directing. Like The Caves of Androzani, Revelation of the Daleks opens with the zoom shot of the planet, cross-fading to the TARDIS materialising in a bleak wilderness, with an opening scene featuring the Doctor and Peri, before moving on to introducing the rest of the guest cast. Harper clearly took elements of what worked well with The Caves of Androzani, and it's a possibility that John Nathan Turner made the decision to hire Graham Harper again, based on the parallel themes from both stories. Filming was carried out in various locations in West Sussex and Hampshire, with the snowy landscapes being unanticipated due to freak weather before filming, but adds to the bleakness of the story. The exterior of Tranquil Repose was an IBM office block in Havant, Hampshire, which gives off an impressive high-tech look. The sleek approach carries on into part of the set design, which was done by Alan Spaulding. Inside Tranquil Repose itself, for the actual parlour sections, the impressive high-class look carries on. From a story point of view, this impressive look of Tranquil Repose gives the impression to the customer of a high-quality area for bodies to be stored or laid to rest. As for Davros's lab and the storage areas, the sets turn to a church catacomb-like appearance, with stone architecture and dimly lit corridors with a Gothic-like impression. This adds to the surreal feel of the whole story, and given the notorious budgets of the day, is very impressive. Incidental music was provided by Roger Limb, who had worked on Graham Harper's previous story, The Caves of Androzani, and as previously mentioned, with the bleak nature of both stories, it isn't really a surprise that Limb reprises a lot of elements from The Caves of Androzani in Revelation of the Daleks, with slow-drawn keyboard chords and the occasional drum beat, which increases the atmosphere of the story. Revelation of the Daleks was broadcast as two 45-minute episodes from the 23rd to the 30th of March 1985 as the final story of Season 22. At the time of broadcast, it had already been decided by the BBC that the show was to go on hiatus due to concerns about the general content. Although the show came back after 18 months, it wasn't a given, and at the time of broadcast, this could have been the last ever show. If that had been the case, then Revelation of the Daleks would have been a downbeat, bleak ending to the show. That isn't directed as a negative criticism towards the story, but given its themes and content, it certainly would have been the ending that Doctor Who needed. Thankfully, it wasn't. One of the criticisms of the show at the time was its level of violence, and as previously mentioned, Revelation of the Daleks is no exception, and watching these types of episodes, you forget that the BBC viewed Doctor Who as a children's programme. Season 22 was a troubled series, with many criticisms aimed at the show from its content to Colin Baker's portrayal of the Doctor, and personally I think the criticisms are somewhat over-exaggerated, and Revelation of the Daleks is a perfect example of all that is good about the Sixth Doctor era of the show. It is full of dark humour, stunning visuals, and interesting characters that makes not only the best story featuring the Sixth Doctor, but one of the best stories from the 80s. Thankfully, as time has passed, a lot of the Sixth Doctor stories have been re-evaluated as stories that are better than what they were given original credit for, but Revelation of the Daleks has always been regarded as the standout story of the era. However, if you are looking for a strong Dalek story, I wouldn't recommend this. It's basically a great story fundamentally about the Daleks, without the Daleks being a main focal point. If you are looking for a focused Dalek story from the 80s, I would strongly recommend the Seventh Doctor story Remembrance of the Daleks. Instead, you have Davros truly develop as an antagonist of his own, so I'd strongly recommend this story as a great Davros story. So, that concludes my review on Revelation of the Dalek. Of course, it is only my opinion, so feel free to express your own in the comments if you think differently. Be sure to tune in for my next video, but if you do have a suggestion for a story to review, then just let me know. Remember, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.